Thank you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for the lovely introduction. I'm especially grateful to the two MMT networks from Spain and Italy, Rete MMT and Red MMT, and Stuart for the wonderful time and program in Spain. So it's really a pleasure to be here. If I were to venture a guess and try to figure out what unites us here in this room, I would say that we are united by a common concern about the future. Concern about us, our lives, our families, our children, our countries. And though we come from very different places, I think that we can devise a common future. I'm a macroeconomist, and I began my work in economics by studying money, a taboo in economics. And I primarily was concerned with the more technical aspects of central banking, of treasuries, of how governments fund projects. And everything I learned led me to one conclusion. We can devise policy that we can call aspirational.
Sí.
Aspirational policy would be one that is inclusive and that aims for social, economic, and environmental justice. So I want to talk a little bit conceptually today about how we can chart a bold, progressive agenda that secures basic needs and basic rights for all people, that provides economic opportunity, restores our sense of dignity, and gives us a reason to hope. And I have found that there is nothing more crippling to our ability to dream than all of the myths that we hear about money and government budgets. So I will just very briefly try to dispel a couple of myths, and that's going to be the first part of the talk. And in the second session, I will actually talk more specifically about the programs and the policies that I've been working on. So there are a couple of things that I'll focus on in this session, and those will be the need to abandon our phobia of deficits. And I also want to make the point that austerity is actually unnatural. There are no technical or economic or moral reasons for austerity. And then in the second session, I'll talk about how do we make the impossible possible. All right, so let's talk about deficits and austerity first. So allow me just a simple thought experiment. So suppose that our little room here is the universe is Spain. At this point, I'm the government. You're the private sector.
Vosotros sois el sector privado.
Let's say we have some firms, some households here.
Empresas.
We have our foreign partners, trading partners
Tienes
here.
aquí
And we can divide this world into these, two groups, the public sector and the private sector. Or three groups, the public sector,
el sector público,
and the domestic private
el sector doméstico privado,
and the foreign sector. We are connected. And the connection the connection that I want to stress is the following. If I'm the government and I provide $100 billion in contract, well, billion is too much for Spain, right?
No.
So $100 billion of contracts to my private sector. I have some people who are building bridges.
Hay algunos que construyen
I have
puentes.
some public school teachers.
Algunos maestros de escuela.
I have unemployed people I support.
Tengo algunos
I spend for various public purposes, for various uses. I spend $100 billion, and of course I impose taxes on my subjects. So I will tax you $80 billion. I have been very irresponsible. I've run a deficit. I spent 100, I only took back 80. And everybody is afraid that I am running a deficit. Wait, where are the $20 billion? Where's the difference? In my contractors, in my public school teachers, in my private sector. I ran a deficit
He incurrido en un déficit
of $20 billion, but my private sector just saved those $20 billion. The word deficit conjures this awful, awful image, this fear, right? But you have to stop calling it the deficit. You have to call it the private sector surplus. Because every one last penny or cent that I spend in excess of the taxes I get back end up in somebody's pocket in the form of savings and surpluses. And this is a simple idea that eludes virtually everybody. Now, I didn't mean to ignore my foreign sector, because my private sector buys product from the foreign sector. I buy product from the foreign sector. And if we buy more from you than you sell to us, you have a surplus. We call it a surplus.
Un superávit, lo llamamos un
You
superávit.
have a surplus. And if we do the opposite, you have the deficit. You send more euros my way. You send more euros our way than we send
De los que os
euros your
enviamos a
way.
vosotros.
And so there is an inherent connection between all of us, between all of these sectors. And if it's not obvious already, it is not possible for all of us to be in surplus. Somebody has to spend in excess of their income so that someone else can get the savings. And that somebody normally is the government in every country, not just in Spain,
En todos los países, no solo en España,
not just in the United
no
States.
solo en Estados Unidos.
The normal position of the public sector, the government sector, is
posición
to be in
normal
deficit.
del
Because the normal position of the private sector is to save. That is a point of logic.
Es una cuestión de lógica.
It's not theory,
No es teoría, no es
hypothesis,
hipótesis.
desire. And so I would like to illustrate what this relationship looks for Spain
Para España.
by showing you a simple graphic, because as they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so this is the picture.
Así que esta es la foto.
So bear with me a little bit. What this picture shows
Lo que enseña esta foto,
is my deficit,
mi déficit
your
y
surpluses
vuestros
together
superávits combinados
as a percentage of the economy.
como porcentaje sobre la economía.
If you're looking at below the line,
Si miráis debajo de la línea,
then we have a minus. We call
tenemos
that a
un
deficit.
signo
right?
negativo, un déficit.
If it's above the line,
Si
it's
está por
positive.
encima, es
It's a
positivo.
surplus. Right? And so here, the red line represents the balance of the government. And as I just said, the normal position of the government is to be in the red. And as I just illustrated, every penny that I spent more than that I taxed ended up somewhere in the private sector. And the first thing that you will observe about this graph is that it shows a mirror image. It's a mirror image of the public sector balance, which is in red, and the private sector balance, which is in black. And it looks like Spain really tried very hard to be fiscally responsible, to balance its budgets, and perhaps even run surpluses. Those, I understand, are the Zapatero surpluses. And I suspect they probably were considered a great achievement at the time. Okay, we had a similar story during the Clinton years, and I was a forecaster at the time, and I was looking in horror
Y contemplaba con horror
how the private sector got into a large deficit as the public sector moved into surplus.
a medida,
But of course, we know that already,
pero ahora ya lo sabemos,
because if I spend 100 billion
porque si yo gasto 100.000 millones
and I tax you 150, you just lost 50. You were in deficit.
estáis en déficit.
I was fiscally responsible
fui
by making you
haciéndoos
fiscally irresponsible. Okay. And so it seems that that's what happened in Spain as well. During 2005 to 2007, the private sector ran negative balance. But of course, the story is actually much worse, because I'm right now looking at the government versus the two private sectors, but I want to separate them and to see where are those deficits in fact, and they are not in the foreign sector.
No,
They are in the private domestic
están en el
sector.
sector.
So if we break up that data
Así
for
que si
Spain,
desagregamos esos datos para España,
the orange line is going to show the balance of our trading partners. So as I said, if it's above the zero, it's positive. So the foreigners are having a positive balance. They're
Así que
surpluses. That is their trade surplus, right? But that is and we are net importers of
Somos
foreign product. In terms of balances, we are sending more euros abroad than we are getting. So let's see what's happening in 2005, 6, and 7.
veamos,
I am running a surplus. Foreign sector is running a surplus. The private sector has to accommodate that. Your balance has to be that much bigger. Your negative balance has to be that much bigger to allow us to run
para
surpluses.
permitirnos.
So there are two important points to take away from this picture. The first is that we should never look at a government balance, or government surplus or deficit, in isolation or separate from what is happening to the other sectors. The second point to take away is that we cannot all obviously run surpluses, and some of us are better at financing deficits than others. So before I talk about the financing of
Antes de hablar
deficits,
de la financiación de los déficits,
which is where MMT enters,
moderno,
I just want to just point out, emphasize what I consider to be quite a stunning trend in Spain, that the private sector in Spain has been running negative savings for 10 years. We didn't even do this in the United States, and we borrow a lot. So, we had negative savings during Clinton, then we moved into surplus, then we moved into negative position. But on a sustained basis, for 10 years,
durante 10 años,
to spend more than your income
gastar más que tu renta
is quite an achievement.
es todo un logro.
And that means that is an extraordinary amount of borrowing and debt that the private sector has been carrying. So the private sector has to borrow to fund those deficits, and that cannot last forever. It's normal for the private sector to save for rainy days, to retain earnings. We say how important it is for the private sector to be prudent, to save a little bit. But in the same breath, we are also saying that if the private sector saves, the public sector has to save by mathematical identity.
Por identidad matemática.
Suppose that we balanced our trade with our trading partners, zero trade deficit. It's still true that if you want to save, I have to
Sigue siendo cierto
save.
que si queréis ahorrar, yo tengo que desahorrar.
And it looks like the only way that the Spanish private sector was able to save is when the government eventually moved into very large deficit
Cuando
after
el
the
gobierno
Great Crisis.
finalmente
It looks like Spain also managed to shrink its net imports and slowly begin to become a net exporter. But we know that for the Eurozone as a whole, that cannot be a solution for everybody to be a net exporter.
No.
In fact, the consistent net exporters for the Eurozone as a whole have been Netherlands and Germany. Greece was a net importer during the entire time. Italy was a net importer
Italia
during this period, the same as Spain.
Igual que España,
Virtually all countries,
prácticamente todos los países
periphery and France and
de la
Belgium
periferia
have
y
been
Francia y
net
Bélgica
importers.
han sido importadores netos.
And so for the Eurozone, the Euro reserves that Germany is accumulating through trade are the Euro reserves that the partners in the Eurozone are losing. If we all become fiscally prudent like Germany and begin to net export, then Germany has to become the net importer. All right, so this is the relationship.
Esta es la relación.
Okay. And so the final point that I want to make is that
Así que el último
this is
punto,
true for every single country, obviously, because it's just an accounting identity, right?
en un tributo contable.
Except some countries are able to run deficits in a way that others are not. And that crucially depends on the monetary system in question. We have systems which we call sovereign systems and systems that are not sovereign
Y sistemas que no lo son.
in the following sense. A sovereign monetary system
Un sistema monetario soberano
is usually the norm around the world, where a nation
en el que una nación
issues its own currency,
emite su propia moneda.
and it has two
Y
institutions,
tiene dos instituciones,
fiscal institution
instituciones fiscales
and a monetary
y una
institution
institución monetaria.
that coordinate in an organic way to meet government payments. In the United States,
En los Estados Unidos,
the Federal Reserve
la Reserva Federal
never bounces a government check. There are lots of complications of how this happens, but the Federal Reserve stands behind the government. If Congress passes a budget, the Federal Reserve ensures that the funding is there. It's the same for Japan,
lo mismo para Japón,
United
para
Kingdom,
el Reino Unido,
for Canada.
para Canadá.
Now, we too try to restrain government spending in
Nosotros
various
también
ways.
maneras.
But that usually happens in Congress.
Pero eso suele
Congress
ocurrir en el Congreso.
has to decide what they want to pass, what the budget is. But the money is not the issue.
Y
It's
el
not the
Congreso
problem.
decide.
And then there are countries which are not monetarily sovereign that have given up voluntarily their own currency, like Ecuador, which is a dollarized
ejemplo,
nation, which absolutely depend
que depende totalmente
on private creditors for dollars.
Acreedores.
So they either have to borrow the
O
dollar
sea que-
or they have to earn it
O lo
through
tienen-
exports. There is no central bank that stands behind
No
the
hay
public
ningún
sector. And the Eurozone is a unique arrangement in the history of the world in which we have a monetary union
Donde tenemos una unión monetaria
without a fiscal union,
sin una unión fiscal.
without a fiscal authority that will conduct fiscal policy for the Eurozone as a whole, and it will coordinate it with the European Central
Sin
Bank.
una
So I will conclude actually in
Así
just
que-
a minute or two, and to say that
Para
we
decir-
need to start a shift in our thinking
tenemos
about what government spending is.
sobre
It's not, deficits are not good nor bad. They're a technical result of the saving behavior of the private
Del-
sector
¿no?
and the trading
y de
relationships
las
that we have with the
relaciones
rest of the world.
comerciales que mantenemos con el resto del mundo.
So deficits are almost by definition necessary. But we know that not all government spending is created equal. Some government spending achieves the economic objectives and some do not. Right?
Y
Some
otros no
spending
los
is bad or doesn't achieve the goals.
No, no.
So deficits are also not under the direct control of the government.
Así.
As much as you try to
Por mucho que se
balance the
empeñéis
budget,
en
or I
equilibrar el
try, I'm the
presupuesto.
government.
O yo
right?
intento, porque yo soy el gobierno.
I may slash programs and
Puedo
raise taxes,
recor-
but if that just undermined my economy, I'm not going to get the tax revenue
voy a
I
rec-
expected.
no voy a-
So these things, even this expenditure, is not directly under my control, because if my economy is doing poorly, automatically I have to spend to support my unemployed. So what the modern money approach, basically, the questions that the modern money approach leads to
Las-
are the more difficult
Son
questions.
las cuestiones más difíciles.
How do we spend?
¿Cómo gastamos?
That is the more important question.
Esa es la pregunta más importante.
Not whether the government will go broke. So in sovereign currency regimes, but in non-sovereign currency regimes
que
as
en
well,
regímenes-
the focus has to be on the economic effect, not on the balance. The trouble is that
El problema
that different monetary regimes allow different policy space. Truly sovereign regimes allow much larger policy space to conduct economic policy. In countries like Ecuador, the Eurozone, the policy space is shrunk. And so in the next session, I will discuss
siguiente
concrete policies that we might
sesión-
consider. Thank you for your time.
Muchas gracias.